Okay. Right, I'm just going to ask Dr. McFarlane, just because we've been sending out so many questionnaires to everybody, I just thought it would be really helpful to just get a little bit of, so Dr. McFarlane can say something about what we're doing in terms of research. So, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. I'd just like to say thanks to Sue for a few top tips. It's always useful for an Ulsterman to have a bit of advice on how to pronounce words properly. This is a very powerful recruitment ad that was first used in the Boer War by Lord Kitchener to recruit individuals for the army. Now, we're not recruiting you for the army, but the purpose of this is to remind me that this research is about you and that it cannot work unless we get you to participate. We've had a long history of research over the last 20 years in Newcastle, and a lot of that has been laboratory-based research. But over the last few years, you will notice that that is increasingly becoming clinical research. The first thing I want to talk about is actually a new study that's going to be ongoing. It started in April, and it's funded by the Medical Research Council, the MRC. And this really builds on work that we had started perhaps about 5 years ago. And it relies on us collecting a lot of data on our patients with mitochondrial disease, routine clinical data, but collecting that in a systematic way. And in fact, it's not just going to be us in Newcastle here collecting this, but colleagues in London will also be collecting it, and not be collecting this data just in those two centres, but actually going out into the country and collecting it at other centres in Birmingham, down south in Southampton, up in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and across in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And the purpose of doing that is that we get at least, well, we're aiming to get 1,500 patients with mitochondrial disease. And having 1,500 patients with mitochondrial disease means that we can identify particular subgroups of patients with particular problems. As I say, the data will be collected in London and in Newcastle. It will all be stored here in Newcastle securely. It won't be a paper record, but we will be filling in paper records of data that we collect. We've appointed a clinical fellow who's here today in London, Rob Pickethley, and we've just appointed a clinical fellow here for Newcastle, Victoria, who's also here today. And we hope that through collecting a lot of this clinical information, we will then, at a future date, be able to invite people to participate in clinical trials. But we need to collect that data first, and we need your consent before we do collect that data, because we're collecting it in a systematic way and we're storing that data. So we are obliged to get your consent for doing that. We hope that you will participate in studies like this so that eventually you and other people with mitochondrial disease can benefit. So if you are willing to consent for this, we are prepared to take consent for these studies today. You can see Jeff down at the back there, or Daria who's with him, or indeed myself. And I now want to go on and discuss some of the studies that have been running over the last couple of years, and many of you will have been involved with the exercise study. And a number of you have been huffing and puffing on the exercise bikes or doing the resistance training. And the purpose of this exercise study was to get muscle like this to become muscle like this, if we can. On the top slide here, the bits in blue are affected muscle, muscle that's not working properly. What we want is lots of brown muscle, which you can see on the slide below. And we hope that through possibly a combination of both of these types of exercise, we can get muscle to go from this to this. Now, it's still early days in this study, and we haven't quite managed to do that, but we are seeing that patients feel a lot of benefit from doing exercise, and that they're certainly not getting worse by doing exercise. And there are a number of people involved in this exercise study. Mike Tranell, Jane Newman, our physiotherapist, who's at the back, and Julie Murphy, who's also around, and she will be able to answer questions on some aspects of the muscle. A number of you are also involved in the activity study and are looking to get results back from that. And again, we have got those results with us today. It's on the computer in the little side room. It was uncomfortable to wear these, I know, for 24, 48 hours you had them on. Some of you a bit longer than that. But I think the results have been very helpful. And after all that exercise and activity, of course, comes the fatigue. I'm not going to speak about the fatigue study, but Grania Gorman, who's one of our clinical fellows, is going to be talking about that after the break. She's just had a little baby boy, Joseph, so she knows all about fatigue. And then last year, we had a think about some of the aspects of mitochondrial disease and life that we weren't really addressing. And one of them was a pregnancy study. And this pregnancy study was very interesting. We looked at two groups of patients with mitochondrial disease. Those with a large-scale single deletion in the mitochondrial DNA, so a big bit missing from the mitochondrial DNA, and those with the mutation that causes MELAS. Okay. And we then compared the data we collected from those two groups with data that's published for the UK for all women who are pregnant. And we came up with some very interesting results when we looked at all of that data. And I should say this data was, again, compiled by questionnaire. And I know that you've got questionnaire fatigue because we've been sending out lots of these. And the last one I think we sent out was not a questionnaire. It was a small novel. But they have been very helpful. And this, I think, is illustrated by this study. You can see from this graph that there's a big difference between the three columns. The one at this end is the control data for the UK. And this is for delivery before 37 weeks. So anyone who's born before 37 weeks gestation is by definition premature. So that, in the control population of the UK, is about 7% of the population are born before 37 weeks. The patients with a single deletion, it was about 4%, so within the margins of error. For people with a MELAS mutation, this was in excess of 30%. When we looked at another complication of pregnancy called gestational diabetes, or the development of diabetes when you are pregnant, again, controlled data, less than 1% of all pregnancies in the UK is complicated by gestational diabetes. But about 6% of patients with MELAS mutation had gestational diabetes. And so this goes on. We looked at hypertension, and again, that group much higher than the single deletion. And we looked at mode of delivery being how the child was delivered, whether that was cesarean or instrumental. And again, much higher rates within that single group of complicated deliveries. And again, when we were sitting down about 18 months ago thinking about clinical studies and the sorts of things that we should be addressing, it occurred to us that we don't really ask an awful lot about patients' mental health. And so we decided we should probably assess at least the scale of the problem and see whether there should be changes we're making to how we're running the clinic or the people we're involving in your care. And again, we started with a questionnaire.